I walked out of my son's engagement party and didn't look back. My brother thought I'd lost it. My sister called me twice on the drive home. I didn't answer. That night, sitting in my kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, I kept thinking, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'd misread the whole thing. Maybe Tiffany had just been nervous and it came out badly and I was being too sensitive. I talked myself in circles for 2 hours. Then I remembered the look on my wife's face when she heard what Tiffany said, and I stopped second-guessing myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because the ending doesn't make sense without it. My wife Elaine and I had been married for 31 years when our son Nolan got engaged. We lived in the same house in Guelph where we'd raised him and his younger sister Abby. A brick semi on a quiet street near the university, the kind of neighborhood where people still wave from driveways and kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on. We weren't wealthy people. I worked in facilities management for the school board for 26 years. Elaine had been a dental hygienist until her knees got bad enough that standing all day became impossible. We weren't struggling, but we were careful. We knew the difference between what we wanted and what we could afford, and we'd made our peace with it a long time ago. Nolan was 33 when he met Tiffany. He'd had a few relationships before her, nothing that lasted more than a year or two, and by the time she came along, I think he was ready. He wanted to settle down. That's not a criticism, it's just something I noticed. When a man that age is ready, he sometimes moves faster than he should. He brought her to Sunday dinner about 3 months after they started dating. She was from Oakville, originally. Her parents still lived out there in one of those new builds near the lake, the kind with the 3-car garage and the landscaping that looks like someone from a magazine came and installed it. She worked in marketing for a tech company downtown. She was polished. That's the word I kept coming back to. Polished. Every sentence she finished with a kind of upward lilt, like she was checking that you were following. She laughed at her own observations before you had a chance to react. Elaine tried. I want to be very clear about that because it matters. She made lasagna from scratch that night because Nolan had mentioned once, offhandedly, that Tiffany didn't eat red meat. So Elaine made the whole thing with Italian turkey sausage instead and spent 20 minutes finding a brand that wasn't processed with pork. Tiffany took one bite, put her fork down, and said she was more of a clean eater. She said it gently, like she was doing us a favor by being honest. Elaine smiled and said that was fine and spent the rest of the evening making sure Tiffany had enough bread and salad. After they left, I found Elaine at the sink washing dishes and I asked her what she thought. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I'm sure she's lovely when she's comfortable." I knew what that meant. It meant she wasn't comfortable, and it showed. But Elaine was giving her the benefit of the doubt. That was Elaine's way. She believed in people's best versions. Over the next year, we saw Tiffany maybe 8 or 9 times. She came to Abby's birthday in the spring, to Easter, to a long weekend at my brother's place in Muskoka. Each time there was something. Not a scene. Nothing you could point to and say, there, that's it, that's the problem. It was subtler. It was the way she sighed when Nolan tried to explain our family's inside jokes. The way she'd pull out her phone during conversations and not quite look up when someone was talking to her. The way she'd redirect conversations back to her friends, her job, her parents' recent trip to Portugal. Elaine and I would debrief on the drive home, quietly, and we'd tell each other we were probably being unfair. Then came the long weekend in Muskoka. My brother Hugh has a place up there. Nothing fancy. A 3-bedroom cottage his wife inherited from her parents. We'd been doing a family weekend there every August for probably 15 years. It was a real thing for us. Kids grew up going. Elaine and Hugh's wife Roxanne had a tradition of cooking Friday night dinner together with wine and the radio on, something they'd been doing since before either of our kids were born. It was one of those things that sounds small when you describe it, but means everything when you're in it. Tiffany arrived on Saturday afternoon. She came with a bag of groceries from a specialty store in the city, specialty olive oil, specialty crackers, a wedge of cheese that cost more than our Friday night groceries. She set them on the counter, like she was contributing. Nobody asked her to bring anything. That part was fine. What wasn't fine was what happened in the kitchen that evening. Elaine and Roxanne were cooking again, like always. Tiffany wandered in, and for a few minutes she just stood near the island, watching. Then she said very pleasantly, "You guys should try a different method for that. There are better ways to do it." She was talking about the way Elaine was browning the meat. Elaine had been browning meat that way for 40 years. Roxanne handled it with grace, laughed it off, said something warm and deflecting. Elaine smiled. But when Tiffany left the kitchen, Roxanne caught my eye across the room and raised her eyebrows. I raised mine back. We didn't say anything. Nolan proposed at Christmas. He did it nicely. He took Tiffany to the restaurant in Stratford, where they'd had their first real date, and he had the ring that had been his grandmother's, Elaine's mother's ring, which Elaine had offered freely and with love. When he called us that night to tell us, Elaine was crying happy tears before he finished the sentence. We took them for dinner the following Saturday to celebrate. Everything felt genuine. I thought, maybe I've been reading it wrong. Maybe this is what it looks like when things are actually okay. The engagement party was 3 months later, at Tiffany's parents' place in Oakville. The house was big. I'll say that. There's a difference between a big house and a home, and I've been in enough of both to know which is which, but the house was genuinely impressive. They'd hired someone to cater. There was a bartender. The backyard had those hanging market lights and arrangements of white flowers in copper vases. About 60 people, mostly from Tiffany's side. We knew maybe 8. We got there a little early because Elaine had spent 2 days making a gift, a photo album she'd put together, printed and bound, covering Nolan's whole life up to the engagement. She'd been working on it for weeks. She wanted Tiffany's family to know who Nolan was before the wedding, wanted them to feel connected. That was pure Elaine. Tiffany's mother, Carolyn, greeted us at the door. She was friendly enough, clipped, organized, the kind of woman who runs events the way other people run companies. She took our coats, pointed us toward the bar, and moved on. Her husband Alan shook my hand, mentioned the drive from Guelph, and found someone else to talk to. Elaine and I found Nolan near the back of the house and spent some time with him before things got started. He seemed good, happy, a little distracted maybe, the way you are at your own party. Tiffany circulated. She came by once, kissed Elaine's cheek, said "I'm so glad you made it," and was gone. Then Carolyn tapped a glass and asked everyone to gather in the living room. She spoke for a few minutes about Tiffany, her childhood, her accomplishments, how proud they were. Alan said a few words. Then Carolyn said she wanted to introduce the family who would be joining theirs, and I straightened up because I thought she was going to say something about us. She gestured to Nolan. She said his name. She said, "We're so happy he's becoming part of our family." And then she moved on to something else. That was it. No mention of us, no introduction. Elaine and I were standing 6 feet away. I watched Elaine's expression. She kept smiling. It was the same smile she'd had in the kitchen in Muskoka. After the toast, people broke back into smaller groups. Elaine went to find the bathroom. I went to get us both a drink. When I came back, I couldn't find her right away, and then I heard it. I heard Tiffany's voice, and then I heard Elaine's voice, and they were coming from the hallway off the kitchen, a short hall that led to the back mudroom. I don't know why I stopped. I don't know why I didn't just walk in. Something made me pause outside the door. Tiffany was talking in a low voice, the kind of voice that isn't whispering but doesn't want to carry. She said, "I need to be honest with you about something, because I think it'll be better if we're clear from the start." Elaine said, "Of course." And then Tiffany said, "Nolan and I are going to be building our life together, and that life is going to look different from what you're used to. We'll have our own traditions, our own way of doing things. I think it would be better for everyone if you understood that your role is going to be more limited than you might be expecting." I stood there. Elaine said quietly, "I see." And Tiffany said, "This is going to be our family now. I don't mean that harshly. But you should know where the line is." I walked in. I didn't say anything loud. I didn't make a scene. I looked at Tiffany and I said, "I think we should rejoin the party." My voice was very steady. Tiffany looked at me with an expression I can only describe as unsurprised, like she'd expected me eventually and had made her peace with it. Elaine took my arm. We went back into the party. We stayed for 40 more minutes because Elaine asked me to, and I would do anything Elaine asked me. We spoke to Nolan. We spoke to a couple from Tiffany's mother's book club who were genuinely kind and interested. Elaine held herself with more dignity than I have ever managed in my life. When we said our goodbyes, she hugged Nolan for a long time and told him she loved him. In the car on the way home, she didn't cry. She looked out the window at the highway, and after a while she said, "I think I've been trying very hard for someone who already made a decision about me." I didn't answer. I just drove. I told Nolan the next day. I called him on his lunch break, and I told him exactly what I'd heard and what had been said. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he was sure Tiffany had meant it differently. He said she was nervous about family dynamics. He said she had a complicated history with her own in-laws. Her brother's wife had caused a lot of problems, and she was trying to set expectations early. He said he would talk to her. He didn't call us back for 9 days. When he finally did, it was to explain that he'd talked to Tiffany, and she felt she'd been misunderstood and she was sorry if her words had landed badly. Not that she was sorry for what she'd said, that they'd landed badly. I knew the difference. I told Nolan I appreciated him following up and that I hoped the wedding planning was going well. I was polite, I kept the door open, but something had changed, and both of us knew it. The wedding was set for the following September, a venue on the Niagara Escarpment, beautiful spot, one of those old limestone buildings with a restored barn and grounds that go all the way down to a creek. The kind of place that costs what it costs and doesn't apologize for it. Elaine was not asked to be involved in the planning. I say that plainly because it needs to be said plainly. She wasn't excluded with a confrontation. She was simply not included. There were no calls asking for her opinion on flowers or table arrangements. There was no invitation to come along for a venue walkthrough. The one time she offered, she'd mentioned to Nolan that she'd love to see the space before the day. Tiffany sent a message back through Nolan that the venue had limited pre-event access, and they were keeping the planning streamlined. The word streamlined did a lot of work in that message. Abby noticed. My daughter noticed from across the country. She was living in Vancouver by then, and she called me to say she was worried about how Elaine was handling it. I told her mother was fine. Elaine alls was fine. That was the thing about Elaine that you could mistake for being unaffected, when really it was just grace. But I noticed the other things. The way she'd stopped mentioning the wedding in casual conversation, where before she used to bring it up with a kind of gentle excitement. The way she quietly put away the notebook, where she'd been writing down ideas, venue decoration details she'd thought Nolan might want to know about, a list of family friends who should get an invitation. She just stopped, closed the notebook, put it in the drawer by the telephone. She never mentioned it again. The month before the wedding, we received a seating chart. We were at table 11, I counted. There were 17 tables. The front of the room, tables 1 through 4, were Tiffany's immediate family, her parents, her 2 brothers and their families, her grandmother and aunts. We were at table 11 with my brother Hugh and Roxanne, which I was genuinely glad about. But we were behind Tiffany's cousins and family friends from Oakville whom we'd never met. Elaine looked at the chart. She folded it and put it beside the notebook in the drawer. I said nothing. What was there to say? The wedding day was warm and clear. The kind of September weather that makes you think Ontario is something else entirely. The sky a particular kind of blue that feels almost staged. We drove up the morning of. Elaine wore a deep green dress she'd found at a consignment shop in downtown Guelph and altered herself. She looked beautiful. I told her so 4 times that day. The ceremony was outside on the grounds. The guests were seated on wooden chairs in 2 sections. We were in the 3rd row on the groom's side, which was appropriate. The officiant was someone Tiffany had found online, who specialized in modern and non-religious ceremonies. The vows they'd written themselves were long and specific, and mostly about the couple's shared vision and values, and how much they loved the idea of their life together. Nolan looked happy. I kept watching his face during the ceremony, and he looked like a man who was exactly where he wanted to be, and I was glad about that. I want to be clear about that. Whatever else was happening, I was genuinely glad my son was happy. The reception was in the barn. The space was genuinely beautiful. Exposed beams, candles everywhere, those long farm tables with linen runners. It didn't look like anything Elaine could have afforded to contribute to. And I think that was part of the point, though maybe I'm being uncharitable. We found table 11. Hugh had saved us seats. Roxanne hugged Elaine and held her hands for a moment without saying anything, the way old friends do. The speeches started after dinner. Tiffany's father went first. He was warm, well-prepared, a little theatrical. He talked about Tiffany's childhood, her accomplishments, how hard she worked, how selective she was, and how glad they were that she'd chosen Nolan. He welcomed Nolan to the family and got a big laugh from Tiffany's side of the room, then the maid of honor, then the best man, Nolan's friend from university, a good man, funny and sincere. Then Nolan stood up. He thanked the venue staff. He thanked the wedding party. He thanked his friends by name, 6 or 7 of them. He thanked Tiffany's parents by name. He talked about Tiffany for about 4 minutes, how she'd changed him, how grateful he was, how excited he was for their life together. Then he said, "And of course I want to thank my parents for being here tonight. That was it. For being here tonight. Like we'd driven up from the city to cover a shift." I looked at Elaine. She was looking at her hands on the table. After a moment, she picked up her water glass and took a sip, and looked up with a smile. Because that's who she is. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, exactly. It was quieter than anger. It was the feeling of understanding something completely that you'd been halfway understanding for a long time. The dancing started. We stayed on the floor for the father-son dance, which was Nolan and his new father-in-law, because that was the tradition Tiffany's family had, and no one had asked me. I stood next to Elaine and watched my son dance with another man at his wedding, and I kept my face neutral because Elaine had her hand on my arm. Around 9 o'clock, Elaine said she needed some air, and we walked out to the grounds. The creek was lit up with little solar lights along the path, and the September air had gone cool, and everything was very beautiful and very quiet. We stood by the railing at the edge of the grounds, and Elaine leaned against my shoulder, and I put my arm around her. She said, "I'm proud of him." I said, "Me too." She said, "I want him to be happy." I said, "I know you do." Then she said, "I'm going to need some time after tonight." I said I understood. We went back inside for the cake and stayed until the formalities wound down. And then we found Nolan and hugged him. He hugged us both hard. Tiffany kissed my cheek and thanked us for coming with complete sincerity in her voice. Like the last 2 years had been a misunderstanding, and tonight had cleared everything up. I thanked her and told her she looked beautiful, because she did. We drove home mostly in silence. I didn't sleep well that week. I kept running through things, the way you do. Looking for where I could have done something differently, said something, intervened at a point when intervention might have mattered. I kept coming back to the same thing. There wasn't a moment. There was a direction. And it had been set before I understood what direction we were going. I called Nolan the following Tuesday. He answered on the third ring, sounded cheerful, asked how the drive home had been. I told him the drive was fine. And then I said, "I need to talk to you about some things that have been building up for a while. Not as a criticism of Tiffany, as your father. Because I think you need to hear some of this from me." He went quiet. Then he said, "Dad, I was hoping we could get through at least the first week of marriage before." I said, "I know, and I'm not trying to make this harder. But I watched your mother sit through a wedding, where she was thanked for showing up, and I need you to sit with that for a minute." Another silence. Then he said, "The speech thing." I said, "The speech is one thing. It's a symbol of a bigger thing. And the bigger thing has been going on for 2 years. He didn't get defensive, which surprised me. He said quietly, "I know it hasn't been great." I said, "Your mother made that album. You know she spent weeks on it. I don't know what happened to it." He said, "Tiffany didn't know what to do with it. She has a lot of feelings about her own family, and it's complicated, and she..." He stopped. "I know that's not an answer." I said, "It's not." We talked for nearly an hour. I didn't raise my voice. I wasn't cruel. But I said the things I had been careful not to say for 2 years, and I said them clearly. I told him his mother had done nothing but try. I told him that being included didn't mean being controlling. I told him that the woman who cooked a whole dinner differently because someone mentioned an offhand preference deserved to be treated like family, not like a logistical consideration. Nolan listened. At the end, he said, "I'll think about all of this." I said, "That's all I'm asking." 3 days later, Tiffany called me. Not Elaine, me. She was calm and collected, which I respected even as I braced myself. She said she'd talked to Nolan, and she understood I had concerns, and she wanted to address them directly. She said she'd been working with a therapist for about 18 months on some attachment and family of origin stuff. Her word was stuff, and she knew she had patterns she was working on. She said she didn't want to be the kind of person who drove a wedge between Nolan and his parents because she'd seen what that looked like and it wasn't who she wanted to be. She said, "I think I owe your wife an apology, a real one, not through Nolan." I said, "I think that's right." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know if it'll fix everything, but I want to try." I said, "That's all anyone can do." She called Elaine the following Sunday morning. Elaine took the call in the kitchen and I gave her space. I made coffee and took mine out to the back deck and sat in the October sun for about 40 minutes. When Elaine came outside, her eyes were red. She sat down in the other chair and picked up the mug I'd left for her. I asked how it went. She said she cried. I wasn't expecting that. She wrapped both hands around the mug. She said she'd been awful and she knew it, and she was sorry. She didn't make excuses, she just said it. I asked what Elaine had said. She said, I said I appreciated the call, and I said I hoped we could find a way forward, because Nolan loves her and I love Nolan. I nodded. She said, I'm not ready to act like nothing happened, but I'm willing to try something different. I said that seemed like the right place to be. It wasn't a fairy tale from there. I want to be clear about that. The months after the wedding were not suddenly warm and easy. The Christmas visit that year was the first time we'd been to their condo in Leslieville, and there were moments of awkwardness that we all just moved through, because moving through things is what families learn to do. Tiffany and Elaine cooked dinner together once, a Sunday in February, and I sat in the living room listening to the sound of them talking in the kitchen, and there was a moment where they both laughed at something, and I felt the knot in my chest loosen a little. Not gone, just looser. I think about the speech sometimes. It still stings. I suspect it always will. There are things you can forgive that you can't entirely unfeel. But I also think about Tiffany sitting somewhere and deciding to pick up the phone and call my wife instead of defending herself. And I think that took something real. I don't minimize that. Nolan texted me in March, out of nowhere. Just sent me a photo he'd found. The two of us at a Leafs game, 2009. Him maybe 12 years old, mid-law, hot dog in one hand, dansk from his neck. I don't even remember who took it. Under it he wrote, one of my favorite pictures, thought you should have it. I sat with my phone for a long time. Then I texted back, mine too now. Love you, bud. He replied with a thumbs up, which is his version of emotional honesty, and I smiled at that, and then I put the phone down and went back to whatever I'd been doing. We're still finding our way, that's the honest answer. There's no clean resolution in real life. No moment where the credits roll and you know it all worked out. But Elaine has a drawer that used to hold a notebook full of quiet hurt, and lately she's been putting other things in it. A card Tiffany sent for her birthday. A photo from a dinner in the spring. Small things. The drawer feels different now. That's enough for now. That has to be enough.